The jungle mist clung to the Drinniamore River Valley like a shroud on the morning of July 10, 1944. Captain Joseph Zimmerman stood in the forward observation post of the 127th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Battalion, studying the tree line across the muddy water with field glasses that revealed nothing but shadow and silence. Behind him, spread across a 3-mile defensive arc in the fetid lowlands of Dutch New Guinea, 1,200 American soldiers waited in positions they had spent 2 weeks preparing. Intelligence reports confirmed what the silence already suggested. Nearly 3,000 Japanese troops from the 18th Army were moving through the jungle, attempting to envelope the American position from 3 sides. Every tactical manual Zimmerman had studied at Fort Benning said the same thing. When facing encirclement by a force more than twice your size, you consolidate, you withdraw to better ground, you call for immediate reinforcement. But Lieutenant Colonel Archibald McKechnie, commanding the battalion, had made a decision that contradicted every orthodox principle of defensive warfare. He ordered his men to hold their extended positions. Let the Japanese complete their encirclement. Let them commit their forces to an attack against what appeared to be an isolated, vulnerable American battalion. The decision seemed like tactical madness to staff officers studying maps at General Hall's headquarters 15 miles to the rear. But McKechnie understood something those officers didn't. The terrain, the weather, and the specific capabilities of his infantry battalion had transformed this apparent trap into the most sophisticated killing ground the American Army had yet constructed in the Pacific War. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Name. During the monsoon season, it became a churning torrent that could sweep away men and equipment without warning. But in mid-July, it had subsided to a sluggish, waist-deep stream, its banks choked with kunai grass and secondary jungle growth that limited visibility to 30 yards in any direction. The Japanese 18th Army, under Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, had been retreating westward along the New Guinea coast for 3 months, pursued relentlessly by American and Australian forces. What remained of Adachi's command, once numbering over 100,000 men, had been reduced through combat, disease and starvation to approximately 35,000 effectives, scattered across 200 miles of some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. The Japanese strategy, as American intelligence had pieced together from intercepted radio traffic and interrogated prisoners, was born of desperation masked as offensive action. Adachi planned to concentrate his remaining strength for a surprise attack against the American airfield at Itape, 20 miles to the east. If successful, the assault would disrupt Allied air operations, potentially allow for Japanese reinforcement by sea, and restore some measure of tactical initiative to a force that had been reduced to a starving, disease-ridden remnant. The plan required Japanese forces to cross the Drinniamore River, eliminate the American covering force, and advance rapidly on Itape before reinforcements could arrive. It was, in the assessment of Adachi's own staff officers, a plan with perhaps a 20% chance of success. But 20% was better than the certain annihilation that awaited them if they continued their retreat without food, medicine, or hope. The 127th Infantry Regiment had been assigned to defend the west bank of the Drinniamore as part of the 32nd Division's covering force. The regiment's 3rd Battalion drew the southern sector, a position that military cartographers described as defensible but exposed. The terrain offered advantages and liabilities in equal measure. The kunai grass provided concealment for defensive positions, but it also allowed attacking forces to approach within grenade range before being detected. The river itself was an obstacle, but one that determined infantry could wade across at dozens of points along the battalion's front. McKechnie had studied these factors with the methodical attention of an engineer examining a bridge under load. The lieutenant colonel was a Naval Academy graduate who had transferred to the Army in 1928, bringing with him a mathematical approach to tactical problems that emphasized calculation over instinct. His solution to the defensive challenge was counterintuitive but precisely reasoned. Rather than concentrating his forces into a compact, mutually supporting perimeter, he deliberately extended his line to create gaps that would channel attacking Japanese units into predetermined corridors. Each gap was covered by interlocking fields of machine gun fire, pre-registered mortar concentrations, and artillery support from the 129th Field Artillery Battalion positioned 3 miles to the rear. The defensive system McKechnie designed relied on a concept that was just beginning to gain acceptance in American tactical doctrine: the killing zone. Unlike traditional defensive positions that attempted to stop attacking forces at the forward edge of the battle area, McKechnie's system was designed to allow enemy penetration into carefully prepared areas where American firepower could be applied with maximum efficiency. The Japanese would not be stopped at the river. They would be allowed to cross, to advance through the gaps in the American line, and then be systematically destroyed by fires directed from positions they couldn't see and couldn't effectively engage. Private First Class Daniel McCarthy occupied a foxhole on the battalion's southern flank, dug into the base of a massive hardwood tree, whose roots provided natural overhead cover. The 21-year-old rifleman from Philadelphia had arrived in New Guinea 6 weeks earlier as a replacement, still carrying the soft appearance of stateside training camps. The jungle had already begun its transformation. His uniform, once olive drab, had faded to a mottled grey-green. His face, gaunt from weight loss and the chronic low-grade fevers that afflicted every soldier in the theatre, had acquired the hollow-eyed look of men who had learned that survival required constant vigilance. McCarthy's position had been selected with care that reflected McKechnie's systematic approach to defensive preparation. The foxhole commanded a clear field of fire across 80 yards of kunai grass that led down to the river's edge. To his left, 30 yards distant, Sergeant William Bradford's heavy machine gun team occupied a position dug into the reverse slope of a small rise, invisible to anyone approaching from the east, but perfectly sighted to deliver enfilading fire across McCarthy's sector. To his right, another rifle position maintained visual contact through the undergrowth, creating a chain of mutually supporting positions that extended along the entire battalion front. The soldiers had spent 14 days improving these positions, digging deeper, constructing overhead cover from logs and sandbags, clearing fields of fire while maintaining natural concealment. They had rehearsed their fire plans during daylight, memorizing the location of every tree, every fold in the ground, every piece of terrain that might provide cover to attacking forces. At night, they conducted listening post operations, sending 2-man teams across the river to gather intelligence on Japanese movements and familiarize themselves with the approaches an attacking force would use. This preparation reflected a fundamental shift in American tactical thinking that was remote, occurring throughout the Pacific Theater in mid-1944. The lessons of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and New Guinea had been absorbed, analyzed, and incorporated into doctrine that emphasized firepower over maneuver, preparation over improvisation. The American soldier of 1944 was better trained, better equipped, and infinitely more confident than the Green troops who had faced Japanese forces in the dark early days of the war. The weapons that McCarthy and his fellow infantrymen carried reflected this evolution. The M1 Garand rifle, with its 8-round en-bloc clip and semi-automatic action, gave American riflemen a decisive advantage in sustained fire over Japanese soldiers still armed with bolt-action Arisaka rifles. The difference was not merely mechanical. It represented a philosophical divergence in how each army conceptualized infantry combat. Japanese doctrine emphasized accuracy and ammunition conservation, reflecting an industrial base that struggled to maintain adequate supplies of small arms ammunition. American doctrine emphasized volume of fire, confident that the vast industrial capacity of the United States could supply whatever quantities of ammunition were required. Sergeant Bradford's machine gun position embodied this American approach to firepower. The M1919A6 Browning machine gun was an air-cooled weapon capable of firing 550 rounds per minute with a maximum effective range of 1,500 yards. Unlike the water-cooled M1917 that had served at Guadalcanal, this lighter version could be moved rapidly to engage targets of opportunity. Bradford's crew had been trained to a standard that emphasized conservation during defensive operations. 6 to 9 round bursts, shifting aim point between bursts, maintaining barrel discipline to prevent overheating. But they also knew that when the situation demanded it, the Browning could sustain fire at rates that would shred attacking infantry before they could close to effective assault range. The supporting arms available to McKechnie's battalion represented another decisive advantage that the Japanese could not match. The 129th Field Artillery Battalion had emplaced 12 M2A1105 mm howitzers in positions carefully surveyed and registered on targets throughout the battalion's defensive sector. These weapons could deliver high-explosive, white phosphorus, or proximity-fused shells with accuracy measured in yards, not hundreds of yards. Forward observers attached to each rifle company maintained constant radio communication with the gun batteries, able to call for fire missions that would place shells on target within 3 minutes of identification. The Japanese forces moving through the jungle toward the Drinia Moor possessed none of these advantages. Lieutenant General Adachi's artillery support consisted of a handful of mountain guns and infantry mortars, their effectiveness limited by ammunition shortages that restricted each piece to perhaps 20 rounds for the entire operation. Japanese radio communications had deteriorated to the point where coordination between units was conducted primarily by runner, a system that worked adequately in static defensive positions but proved catastrophically inadequate for offensive operations, requiring precise timing and mutual support. More critically, the Japanese forces approaching the American positions were physically depleted in ways that American intelligence had not fully appreciated. Chronic malnutrition had reduced the average Japanese soldier's body weight by 30 to 40 pounds. Malaria, dengue fever, and dysentery affected an estimated 60% of frontline troops. Many soldiers were surviving on less than 1,000 calories per day, subsisting on foraged roots, insects, and the occasional supply drop that managed to evade Allied air interdiction. These men were still dangerous. They retained their tactical training, their unit cohesion, and their willingness to die in attack. But they lacked the physical stamina required for the kind of sustained offensive operations that Adachi's plan demanded. As the afternoon light began to fade on July 10th, the first confirmed reports of Japanese movement reached battalion headquarters. Native scouts working with American intelligence teams had observed large formations moving westward through the jungle, converging on crossing points along the Drinia Moor. Radio intercepts suggested that the Japanese planned to attack in multiple waves, with the first assault scheduled for the following night. The intelligence was sufficiently detailed that McKechnie could predict with reasonable accuracy where the main Japanese effort would occur and how forces would be committed. The lieutenant colonel issued his final orders to company commanders in a meeting held in the battalion command post, a reinforced bunker dug into the hillside 200 yards behind the forward positions. His instructions were precise and left no room for ambiguity. Companies would hold their positions regardless of penetration. No withdrawal without explicit orders. Forward observers would remain in position even if bypassed by Japanese forces, continuing to call artillery fire on targets behind the American line. Machine gun crews would engage targets according to predetermined fire plans, not react to the most immediate threat. The goal was not to stop the Japanese at the river line. The goal was to destroy them after they had committed to their attack, when they would be most vulnerable to American firepower and least able to maneuver or withdraw. Captain Zimmerman returned to his company positions and briefed his platoon leaders with the same clinical precision. The Japanese would cross the river in force. They would advance through the gaps between positions. American soldiers would hold fire until targets entered the designated killing zones, then engage with overwhelming firepower. No individual heroics, no breaking of fire discipline. The battle would be won or lost based on adherence to the plan, not individual initiative. Private McCarthy listened to his squad leader relay these instructions with the particular attention that soldiers develop when they understand their survival depends on following orders precisely. The young private had learned enough about combat in his brief time in New Guinea to recognize that this battle would be different from the sporadic contact and ambush actions that had characterized the regiment's operations over the previous month. This would be a set-piece engagement, the kind of battle that was won by preparation and firepower, not courage or luck. As darkness settled over the Driniumor Valley on the evening of July 10th, the soldiers of the 3rd Battalion completed their final preparations. Ammunition was checked and rechecked. Grenades were placed within easy reach. Fields of fire were memorized one last time. The forward listening posts reported increasing sounds of movement from across the river, the unmistakable noise of large numbers of men attempting to move through dense jungle with tactical discipline. The Japanese were coming, and they were coming in strength. McKechnie stood in the battalion operations center, studying the map that showed his defensive positions overlaid with the predicted Japanese axes of advance. The mathematics of the situation were clear. If the Japanese attacked with 3,000 men against his 1,200, and if they achieved surprise or managed to concentrate their forces effectively, they could overwhelm his extended positions through sheer weight of numbers. But if his defensive plan worked as designed, if his soldiers maintained fire discipline and executed according to their training, the attacking Japanese forces would walk into a trap from which there would be no escape. The first reports of contact came at 02:30 on the Raise the Comparation, morning of July 11th. Japanese forces had begun crossing the Driniumor at multiple points along the battalion front, wading through the chest-deep water in columns that stretched back into the jungle darkness. American listening posts, positioned on the east bank, reported estimated strengths and directions of movement before withdrawing to their primary positions. The information was relayed to artillery fire direction centers, where gun crews stood ready at their weapons. McKechnie issued the order to commence fire at 0300. The night erupted as 12 105mm howitzers fired in unison, sending high-explosive shells arcing over the jungle to detonate among the Japanese assembly areas east of the river. The barrage was precisely calculated. 3 minutes of intensive fire designed not to destroy the attacking force, but to disrupt their timing and force them to deploy prematurely. As the artillery fire lifted, the Japanese response confirmed that Adachi had committed major forces to the assault. The distinctive crack of Japanese rifle fire began to echo across the valley, punctuated by the heavier reports of machine guns and the crump of knee mortars. Green signal flares rose into the sky, their eerie illumination revealing glimpses of soldiers moving through the kunai grass toward American positions. The assault had begun, and the Japanese were advancing with the grim determination of men who understood this might be their last offensive operation of the war. Sergeant Bradford's machine gun crew waited in their position, watching through the darkness as muzzle flashes revealed the approximate location of the advancing Japanese forces. Bradford had his hand raised, signaling his gunner to hold fire. The predetermined engagement range was 60 yards. The Japanese were at 100, then 80, then closing rapidly through the grass. At 65 yards, Bradford dropped his hand. The Browning erupted with a sound like tearing canvas, sending red tracer rounds cutting through the night in flat trajectories that found their targets with mechanical precision. The effect on the advancing Japanese was immediate and devastating. The machine gun's enfilading fire cut across the front of the assault formation, each burst striking multiple targets as soldiers bunched together while moving through the restricted avenues of approach that McKechnie's defensive plan had created. Men fell in clusters, their momentum carrying them forward even as wounds proved mortal. The Japanese infantry, trained to close rapidly with defending forces to negate firepower advantages, found themselves caught in the open, unable to advance and unwilling to retreat. Along the entire battalion front, the pattern repeated with variations. American riflemen held their fire until Japanese soldiers appeared at ranges where even a mediocre marksman could hit a man-sized target. Then the M1 Garands began their work, each rifle capable of firing aimed shots as fast as the soldier could acquire targets. The semi-automatic action that American doctrine emphasized proved its value in these opening moments of contact, where a bolt-action rifle required a soldier to break his sight picture, work the action, and reacquire the target between shots. The Garand allowed continuous engagement without interruption. Private McCarthy fired his first shots of the battle at a Japanese soldier who appeared 30 yards from his position, emerging from the kunai grass with his rifle at port arms. McCarthy's first round struck the soldier in the chest. His second hit another target to the left. His third, fourth, and fifth rounds found additional targets as the assault wave attempted to cross the killing zone. When his 8-round clip ejected with its distinctive ping, McCarthy reloaded smoothly, muscle memory taking over as his conscious mind struggled to process what he was witnessing. The Japanese forces, despite taking horrific casualties in the initial contact, did not break or withdraw. This was the fundamental reality that separated Pacific warfare from combat in other theaters. Japanese soldiers, indoctrinated with Bushido values that considered surrender the ultimate dishonor, continued to attack even when tactical logic dictated withdrawal. They advanced over the bodies of their dead comrades, seeking to close the distance where bayonets and grenades might succeed where rifle fire had failed. This determination to continue attacking into overwhelming firepower was exactly what McKechnie's defensive plan had anticipated and prepared to exploit. As Japanese forces penetrated through the gaps between American positions, they entered areas where pre-registered artillery and mortar concentrations could be employed without risk to friendly troops. Forward observers, speaking calmly into their radio handsets, called for fire missions that brought high-explosive shells crashing down on Japanese soldiers who thought they had successfully infiltrated the American defensive line. The battle's first phase continued through the pre-dawn darkness, a chaotic symphony of violence illuminated by muzzle flashes, tracer rounds, and the brief hellish glare of artillery bursts. By the time the first grey light of dawn began filtering through the jungle canopy at 0530, the tactical situation had evolved into precisely the circumstance that would define the next 4 days of fighting. The Japanese had achieved penetration at multiple points along the American line, but rather than exploiting these penetrations to roll up defensive positions or advance toward objectives in the rear, Japanese forces found themselves trapped in compartments where American firepower could be applied with devastating efficiency. The mathematics of the engagement were beginning to tell a story that would only become clear in the aftermath. But even in these early hours, the soldiers of the 3rd Battalion were learning a fundamental lesson about modern warfare. Superior numbers meant nothing against superior preparation. Courage was not a match for firepower. And in the jungle warfare of the Pacific, the side that controlled the terrain and could mass fires at decisive points would prevail, regardless of the enemy's determination or tactical skill. The morning of July 11th revealed the true scale of the Japanese commitment and the effectiveness of McKechnie's defensive scheme. As visibility improved with the rising sun, American observers could see bodies scattered across the approaches to their positions, lying in patterns that told the story of each failed assault. But the Japanese showed no signs of abandoning their offensive. If anything, the daylight revealed that Adachi had committed even more forces than intelligence estimates had predicted. Captain Zimmerman moved through his company positions, assessing ammunition expenditure and redistributing supplies to ensure each position maintained adequate stocks for sustained operations. The soldiers, exhausted from 6 hours of continuous combat, showed the strain in their hollow eyes and trembling hands. But they had held. Not a single American position had been overrun, and the defensive line remained intact despite multiple penetrations that had been systematically eliminated through coordinated fires. The Japanese tactical response to their initial failures demonstrated both the strengths and fatal weaknesses of their military doctrine. Rather than withdrawing to reassess and develop new approaches, Japanese commanders committed additional forces to reinforce the attacks that had already failed. This reflected the offensive-minded spirit that permeated Imperial Army training, but it also revealed a dangerous inflexibility when confronting defensive systems specifically designed to exploit such predictable responses. Lieutenant Takeshi Nakamura led the remnants of his company through the jungle east of the Kasparos, Driniomore, attempting to regroup after the disastrous night assault. Of the 130 men who had crossed the river with him, fewer than 40 remained effective. The rest were dead, wounded, or separated in the darkness and confusion of combat. Nakamura was a veteran officer who had survived campaigns in China and the Philippines, but what he had encountered during the night assault defied his understanding of American fighting capabilities. The defensive fire had been too accurate, too sustained, too well coordinated to be the product of frightened soldiers firing blindly into the darkness. Every gap in the American line that appeared to offer a route of advance had proven to be a carefully designed trap. Machine gun fire came from unexpected directions, catching his men in deadly crossfires. Artillery shells fell with precision that suggested the Americans had pre-planned every target, requiring only seconds to bring devastating fires on any concentration of Japanese troops. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. What Nakamura could not know was that he was confronting the cumulative result of 3 years of American tactical evolution in the Pacific. The lessons of every engagement from Guadalcanal forward had been systematically analyzed, incorporated into training programs, and disseminated throughout the army. The soldiers he faced were not the green, uncertain troops that had first encountered Japanese forces in 1942. They were professionals who had been trained to fight as integrated teams, maximizing the capabilities of their weapons while minimizing exposure to enemy fire. The Japanese plan for the second day's operations called for a coordinated assault from 3 directions simultaneously, attempting to overwhelm the American positions through attacks that would prevent mutual support between defending units. Major General Naoki Miyake, commanding the Japanese forces in this sector, had approximately 2,500 effective soldiers remaining from his original force of 3,000. He committed them all to attacks scheduled to begin at 1400 hours, hoping that daylight operations would allow for better coordination than the chaotic night battles. McKechnie received intelligence of the planned assault through radio intercepts decoded by American cryptographers working at higher headquarters. The information provided him with precise timing and approximate locations of the Japanese assembly areas. He used this intelligence to refine his defensive fires, coordinating with artillery and air support to strike Japanese forces before they could launch their attacks. At 13:30, 30 minutes before the scheduled Japanese assault, American artillery opened fire on the assembly areas. The barrage was unlike anything the Americans had yet delivered. 72 rounds per gun, fired over a 20-minute period, saturated an area of approximately 2 square miles with high explosive and white phosphorus shells. The white phosphorus was particularly effective in the jungle environment, igniting the dry kunai grass and creating walls of flame that forced Japanese soldiers to abandon their covered positions. Those who fled the flames ran directly into concentrations of high explosive shells that detonated above ground, sending lethal fragments through the jungle canopy. When the artillery fire lifted at 13:50, American forward observers reported that the Japanese assembly areas had been devastated. But incredibly, the attacks proceeded anyway. Japanese officers, following orders that could not be changed without breaking radio silence, led their surviving soldiers forward into assaults that had already been compromised by the preliminary bombardment. The discipline this required was remarkable, but it also demonstrated the fatal rigidity that characterized Japanese tactical thinking when confronted with situations their doctrine had not anticipated. Private McCarthy watched the second day's assault develop with a growing sense of unreality. He had fired over 120 rounds since the battle began, more than he had expended during all his training. His shoulder ached from the Garan's recoil, his hands were black with powder residue, and his ears rang from the constant noise of battle. Yet Japanese soldiers continued to advance, continued to attack positions that had already proven impregnable to their tactics. The M1 Garand in McCarthy's hands represented a decisive technological advantage that Japanese planners had failed to adequately account for. The Arisaka Type 99 rifle that equipped Japanese infantry was an excellent bolt-action weapon, accurate and reliable, but it required a trained soldier approximately 4 seconds to work the bolt, eject the spent cartridge, chamber a fresh round, and reacquire his target. In those 4 seconds, an American soldier with a Garand could fire 4 aimed shots. Multiply this advantage across hundreds of riflemen engaged simultaneously, and the difference became overwhelming. Sergeant Bradford's machine gun position became the focal point of a sustained Japanese assault that afternoon. A reinforced company of approximately 80 Japanese soldiers, led by officers wielding samurai swords, emerged from the jungle in a coordinated rush designed to overwhelm his position through sheer determination. Bradford's crew responded with textbook precision. The gunner traversed smoothly, engaging targets from left to right in 6-round bursts that dropped attackers in clusters. The assistant gunner fed ammunition belts smoothly, ensuring no interruption in fire. Bradford himself called corrections and identified priority targets, maintaining the disciplined fire that doctrine emphasized over panic shooting. The assault lasted less than 3 minutes. When it ended, 72 Japanese soldiers lay dead or dying in front of Bradford's position. The machine gun crew had fired approximately 450 rounds, achieving a kill ratio that would have seemed impossible to military analysts studying pre-war estimates of combat effectiveness. But the reality of industrial warfare in the Pacific had rendered pre-war assumptions obsolete. Superior firepower, when properly employed by trained soldiers in prepared positions, created kill ratios that exceeded anything in military history. The Japanese forces attempting to advance through the gaps in the American line encountered an even more sophisticated challenge. McKechnie had positioned his reserve company, approximately 120 soldiers, in mobile reaction force positions behind the main line. When Japanese penetrations were detected, these reserves would move to blocking positions, and establish new killing zones that trapped enemy forces between the forward defenses and the reserve positions. The Japanese found themselves advancing into pockets from which there was no exit, subjected to fires from multiple directions that eliminated organized resistance within minutes. By nightfall on July 11th, the second day's attacks had failed with even heavier casualties than the first day's operations. American casualty reports indicated 8 killed and 23 wounded, numbers that seemed impossibly low given the intensity of combat. But these figures reflected the fundamental asymmetry of the engagement. American soldiers fought from prepared positions with overhead cover, supported by artillery and air power that Japanese forces could not match. Japanese soldiers attacked across open ground against interlocking fields of fire that had been perfected through weeks of preparation. The night of July 11th into July 12th brought no respite. Japanese forces, apparently convinced that darkness would negate American firepower advantages, launched a series of infiltration attacks designed to penetrate defensive positions and attack from the rear. These tactics had proven effective earlier in the war against less prepared opponents. Against McKechnie's battalion, they resulted in additional casualties without achieving any tactical gain. The infiltration attempts revealed another critical advantage that American forces possessed: superior night vision equipment and illumination capabilities. Artillery units fired star shells that bathed the battlefield in harsh white light, eliminating the darkness that Japanese tactics depended upon. Mortar crews dropped illumination rounds over suspected infiltration routes, creating overlapping zones of visibility that made concealed movement impossible. When Japanese soldiers were detected attempting to infiltrate, they were engaged by rifle fire directed at clearly visible targets, not blind firing into darkness. Corporal James Mitchell manned an outpost position 50 yards forward of the main defensive line, tasked with providing early warning of Japanese movements. The 23-year-old soldier from Oregon had volunteered for this assignment, understanding that outpost duty carried significantly higher risk than positions within the main perimeter. But Mitchell also understood that his position, equipped with a radio and supported by pre-registered artillery fires, represented a critical node in the defensive system. At 02:15 on July 12th, Mitchell detected movement to his front. He whispered into his radio handset, alerting the company command post and requesting illumination. Within 30 seconds, a star shell burst overhead, revealing approximately 30 Japanese soldiers moving in single file toward his position. Mitchell allowed them to approach within 40 yards before engaging with his M1 carbine, a lighter weapon more suitable for close-range combat than the full-sized Garand. His first shots dropped the lead soldiers, creating confusion in the column behind them. The Japanese response was immediate and violent. Rifle fire cracked overhead, forcing Mitchell to take cover in his foxhole. But the outpost had served its purpose. The company command post now had precise location data on a Japanese infiltration attempt. Within 2 minutes, artillery fire began falling on the infiltrators, high explosive shells that detonated with lethal effect among soldiers caught in the open with no cover. Mitchell heard the screams of wounded men mixing with the crack of exploding shells, a sound that would haunt his dreams for decades after the war. The third day of battle, July 12th, saw a subtle shift in Japanese tactics that suggested learning was occurring despite the catastrophic casualties. Rather than launching mass assaults against obvious strong points, Japanese commanders began probing attacks designed to identify weak points in the American defensive system. Small groups of 10 to 20 soldiers would advance cautiously, attempting to draw fire that would reveal American positions. When defenders responded, Japanese observers would note the location and attempt to coordinate artillery or mortar fire against those positions. This more sophisticated approach might have succeeded against less disciplined defenders. American soldiers, trained to hold fire until targets entered predetermined killing zones, refused to be baited into premature engagement. The Japanese probing attacks advanced into empty ground where no defenders were positioned, then found themselves subjected to flanking fires from positions they had not detected. The result was the same as the previous day's operations: Japanese casualties mounting without corresponding American losses. Lieutenant General Adachi, monitoring the battle from his headquarters 15 miles to the west, faced a decision that would define his remaining career and legacy. 3 days of sustained attacks had cost him approximately 1,800 casualties, the majority killed in action. His remaining effective strength was perhaps 1,200 soldiers, many of them wounded or suffering from disease and exhaustion. The original objective of breaking through to Itape had become impossible. Even reaching the American artillery positions behind the forward defensive line seemed beyond his capability. A rational commander, assessing the situation objectively, would have ordered withdrawal. Preserve the remaining force, retreat to more defensible positions, avoid additional casualties in attacks that had no prospect of success. But Adachi was not operating under purely rational constraints. Japanese military culture placed extraordinary emphasis on offensive action and completion of assigned missions. To withdraw without achieving objectives meant admitting failure, accepting dishonor, and potentially facing charges of cowardice from superiors in Tokyo who did not understand the tactical reality on the ground. Adachi ordered a final, all-out assault for the night of July 13th into July 14th. Every remaining soldier would be committed. The attack would focus on a single point in the American line, attempting to achieve breakthrough through concentration of force rather than the dispersed attacks of previous days. It was a desperate gamble by a commander who understood he had no good options remaining. McKechnie received intelligence of the planned assault through the same radio intercepts that had provided warning of previous attacks. But this time, the Japanese were concentrating their remaining strength against a 1,000-yard section of his defensive line, specifically targeting the sector held by Baker Company. The lieutenant colonel faced his own difficult decision. He could reinforce Baker Company, strengthening the threatened sector but potentially weakening other areas. Or he could trust that his defensive system, having worked effectively for 3 days, would continue to function as designed. McKechnie chose to trust his plan and his soldiers. Baker Company received additional artillery support and priority for illumination missions, but no additional infantry reinforcements. The message to Captain Harold Stevens, commanding Baker Company, was characteristically direct: hold your position, execute your fire plan, and inflict maximum casualties on the attacking force. The final Japanese assault began at 01:30 on July 14th with an artillery barrage that represented the expenditure of virtually all remaining Japanese ammunition stocks. Approximately 200 shells fell on Baker Company's positions over a 15-minute period, a bombardment that would have been inconsequential by European theatre standards, but represented a significant effort for the ammunition-starved Japanese forces. The barrage caused 3 American casualties and provided the attacking forces with the psychological boost of supporting fires. At 01:45, approximately 1,000 Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle in a coordinated assault that represented everything Adachi could still commit to offensive operations. They advanced in multiple waves, officers leading from the front with drawn swords, soldiers fixing bayonets and preparing for close combat. The traditional banzai cry echoed across the valley, a sound designed to inspire attacking troops and terrify defenders. The Americans responded with professional calm. Baker Company's defensive fires opened simultaneously across the entire threatened sector. Machine guns, rifles, mortars, and artillery created a storm of steel that struck the advancing Japanese with industrial efficiency. The effect, was catastrophic. The leading wave, approximately 300 soldiers, was essentially destroyed in the first 2 minutes of contact. Bodies piled up in drifts, where machine gun fire had caught densely packed formations. The second wave advanced, over their dead comrades, closing to within 30 yards of some American positions before being stopped by concentrated fire. Private McCarthy, positioned in Baker Company's southern sector, experienced the assault as a succession of targets appearing in his rifle sights. Fire, shift aim, fire again, reload. Fire. The mechanical repetition created a surreal sense of disconnect between action and consequence. Each trigger press meant death for a Japanese soldier, but the emotional weight of that reality would not register until days or weeks later, when the immediate demands of survival no longer consumed all conscious thought. The climax of the assault came when approximately 200 Japanese soldiers achieved penetration through a narrow gap between two American positions, advancing 50 yards into the defensive system before being detected. This was the moment that McKechnie's entire defensive plan had been designed to exploit. Rather than panic or attempt hasty reinforcement, American commanders calmly executed the planned response to penetration. Artillery fires were shifted to seal off the penetration, preventing additional Japanese forces from following. Machine guns repositioned to deliver flanking fire into the penetration. The reserve company moved to blocking positions that prevented the penetrating force from advancing further or retreating. The 200 Japanese soldiers who had achieved this penetration found themselves trapped in a pocket approximately 100 yards deep and 50 yards wide, subjected to fires from 3 directions with no possibility of withdrawal. They fought with desperate courage, attempting to storm American positions that had clear fields of fire and prepared defenses. Within 30 minutes, organized resistance within the pocket had ceased. American casualties in eliminating this penetration: 2 killed, 7 wounded. Japanese casualties: 198 killed, 2 captured wounded. By 0400, the final Japanese assault had expended itself against defenses that had proven impervious to everything Adachi could commit. The survivors, perhaps 300 soldiers from the original attacking force of 1,000, retreated into the jungle in small groups, abandoning equipment and wounded in their haste to escape the killing ground. Japanese offensive capability in the sector had been effectively destroyed. The morning of July 14th revealed the full scale of the disaster that had befallen the Japanese 18th Army. American patrols moving through the battlefield counted approximately 2,800 Japanese bodies in and around the defensive perimeter. Equipment lay scattered across square miles of jungle: rifles, machine guns, mortars, ammunition, personal effects, all abandoned in the retreat. Medical personnel treating wounded American soldiers discovered Japanese diaries and letters that revealed the physical condition of the attacking forces: chronic malnutrition, untreated diseases, desperation born of months of defeat and privation. The final casualty figures for the 4-day battle told a story that military historians would analyze for decades. American losses: 43 killed, 112 wounded. Japanese losses: approximately 2,800 killed, with several hundred additional wounded who were evacuated or died later from their injuries. The exchange ratio exceeded 65-1, a disparity that seemed impossible until examined against the specific circumstances of the engagement. McKechnie's defensive system had functioned exactly as designed. Japanese forces had been channeled into killing zones where American firepower could be applied with maximum efficiency. Artillery support had disrupted Japanese attacks before they could develop momentum. Machine guns positioned for enfilading fire had created casualties that traditional frontal engagement could never achieve. Most critically, American soldiers had executed their assigned tasks with professional discipline, avoiding the panic or confusion that might have allowed Japanese tactics to succeed. The strategic consequences of the battle extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. General Adachi's offensive capability had been eliminated, forcing Japanese forces in New Guinea into purely defensive operations for the remainder of the war. The Itape airfield remained secure, enabling Allied air operations that would support the continued advance along the New Guinea coast. Most importantly, the battle demonstrated conclusively that American forces had achieved a level of tactical sophistication that rendered Japanese offensive doctrine obsolete. The human cost of this demonstration was borne almost entirely by Japanese soldiers who fought with courage and determination against a defensive system they had no capability to overcome. Many of these soldiers were veterans of earlier campaigns, experienced infantry, whose loss represented an irreplaceable depletion of Japanese military capability. Their deaths were not meaningless sacrifices to abstract strategic objectives, but the inevitable result of a tactical doctrine that emphasized spiritual qualities over material realities. For the American soldiers who fought at the Driniamore River, the victory provided validation of training methods and tactical concepts that had been developed through painful experience in earlier campaigns. They had demonstrated that defensive positions, properly prepared and supported by adequate firepower, could defeat numerically superior attackers, regardless of their determination or fighting spirit. The lesson would be applied in subsequent battles across the Pacific, contributing to the steady erosion of Japanese combat effectiveness that would ultimately lead to surrender. Private McCarthy emerged from his foxhole on the afternoon of July 14th, physically and emotionally exhausted, from 4 days of sustained combat. The young soldier from Philadelphia had fired over 400 rounds, a volume of fire that would have seemed impossible in peacetime training. He had witnessed death on a scale that no 19-year-old should experience, watched men die in waves as they charged against defenses they could not overcome. The memories would remain vivid for the remainder of his life, periodically surfacing in dreams and quiet moments when his mind wandered back to the jungle valley where he had learned the true cost of war. Sergeant Bradford supervised the cleaning and maintenance of his machine gun, running patches through the barrel to remove the carbon fouling that accumulated after firing thousands of rounds. The weapon had performed flawlessly throughout the engagement, never jamming or malfunctioning despite sustained use under difficult conditions. Bradford understood that mechanical reliability was only part of the equation. The training that had taught him and his crew to employ the weapon effectively, to maintain fire discipline and select appropriate targets, had proven equally essential to their survival and success. Captain Zimmerman walked through his company positions, speaking quietly with soldiers who were experiencing the aftermath of combat for the first time. The exhaustion, the shakes, the inability to sleep despite overwhelming fatigue, these were all normal responses to abnormal experiences. Zimmerman knew from his own earlier combat that the psychological impact would fade with time, but that certain images and sounds would remain permanently imprinted in memory. The battlefield itself bore witness to the violence of the engagement. Shell craters pockmarked the ground where artillery had struck. Trees were shattered by explosions, their trunks splintered and white against the jungle green. The kunai grass was trampled flat along the approaches where Japanese forces had advanced repeatedly into American defensive fires. And everywhere, scattered across the landscape, lay the evidence of human fragility when exposed to industrial weapons. Lieutenant General Adachi survived the battle, but his military career was effectively ended by the defeat. His surviving forces continued to retreat westward, harassed by Allied air attacks and ground pursuit, diminishing daily through combat losses, disease, and starvation. At the war's end, Adachi would surrender with fewer than 13,000 of the 100,000 soldiers he had commanded at the campaign's beginning. He would later commit suicide while awaiting trial for war crimes, choosing death over dishonor in the final expression of the Bushido code that had informed his military career. For McKechnie and the 3rd Battalion, the Drinyamoor River battle became a case study in defensive warfare that would be analyzed and taught at military schools for generations. The fundamental principles demonstrated in those 4 days of combat would inform American defensive doctrine throughout the remainder of the 20th century: preparation over improvisation, firepower over maneuver, coordination over individual heroics. The 1,200 American soldiers who allowed themselves to be encircled by Japanese forces had accomplished something that seemed impossible when examined objectively. They had not merely survived against odds of more than 2 to 1, they had inflicted a defeat so complete, so devastating, that Japanese offensive capability in the sector ceased to exist. They had killed 2,800 enemy soldiers while losing fewer than 50 of their own. And they had done so not through luck or enemy incompetence, but through professional execution of a carefully designed defensive plan. The jungle that had witnessed this transformation in warfare fell silent in the days following the battle. The monsoon rains returned, washing away the physical traces of combat, slowly reclaiming the cleared fields of fire and erasing the scars of artillery. But the lessons learned in that valley would endure, carried forward by the soldiers who survived and incorporated into the institutional knowledge of an army that was learning, with each engagement, how to fight and win in the most hostile environments on Earth. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The sky over Berlin on the morning of March 6, 1944, was clear and cold. Oberleutnant Heinz Noack climbed into the cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 109, running through his pre-flight checks with the mechanical precision of a man who had done this 300 times before. He was a skilled fighter pilot, a veteran of the Eastern Front and the defense of the Reich, and he knew what to expect from the Americans when they came. The heavy bombers, the flying fortresses and liberators would appear first, their formations tight and defensive, bristling with 50-caliber machine guns. Then would come the escorts, the thunderbolts and lightnings, fighters with enough range to shepherd the bombers partway into Germany before their fuel forced them to turn back. It was a predictable pattern, a tactical dance the Luftwaffe had learned to anticipate. The German fighters would wait, circling at altitude, letting the short-range American escorts reach their limit and peel away. Then the slaughter would begin. But today, something was different. As Noack's squadron climbed to intercept the incoming bomber stream, he noticed the fighter escorts were still there. They should have turned back by now. They were deep over German territory, far beyond the operational radius of any American fighter he knew. And yet there they were, sleek single-engine aircraft with distinctive bubble canopies and laminar flow wings, weaving protectively around the bombers as they pressed toward the capital. They were P-51 Mustangs, a type he had encountered before and dismissed as adequate but unremarkable. Just another fighter. But now, here they were, over Berlin itself, hundreds of kilometers from their bases in England. It should have been impossible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Noack was not alone in his confusion. Across the Third Reich's fighter command, experienced pilots were reporting the same thing. American escorts appearing where no escorts should be, staying with the bombers all the way to the target and back again. The strategic calculus that had governed the air war over Europe for 2 years was suddenly catastrophically wrong. For the Germans, the P-51 Mustang represented more than just another aircraft. It represented the collapse of their entire defensive strategy, the end of any hope that the Reich could survive the relentless tide of American industrial power. This is the story of how a fighter plane that German pilots initially regarded as unremarkable became the weapon that broke the back of the Luftwaffe, not through superior performance in dogfights, but through the simple, devastating reality of range. To understand the shock of that March morning, you must first understand what German fighter pilots believed about the nature of air warfare in 1943 and early 1944. The Luftwaffe's defensive doctrine rested on a fundamental assumption that Allied fighters lacked the range to escort their bombers deep into German territory. This was not mere propaganda or wishful thinking. It was a conclusion supported by 2 years of operational experience and the known limitations of fighter aircraft design. Every fighter the Allies had deployed thus far, the Spitfire, the Thunderbolt, the Lightning, was constrained by fuel capacity. They could escort bombers to the German border, perhaps a bit beyond, but then physics intervened. Fuel ran low, and the escorts had to turn back or risk running dry over enemy territory and being captured or killed. This limitation was not an engineering oversight but a consequence of fundamental design trade-offs. A fighter aircraft, by definition, needed to be fast and maneuverable. That meant minimizing weight and drag. Internal fuel tanks could only be so large before they compromised the aircraft's performance and center of gravity. External drop tanks helped, but even with them, existing Allied fighters had an effective combat radius of perhaps 400 to 500 kilometers. Berlin lay more than 900 kilometers from the bomber bases in England. The math was simple and unforgiving. No Allied fighter could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and still have enough fuel to fight on the way home. For the Luftwaffe, this gap in escort coverage was the one tactical advantage they retained as the war turned against them. By late 1943, the German war machine was stretched to its limits. The Eastern Front consumed men and materiel at a staggering rate. Allied bombing was beginning to disrupt production. Fuel was increasingly scarce. The Luftwaffe could no longer afford to contest every Allied raid. They had to pick their battles carefully, husbanding their dwindling resources. The strategy was to avoid the well-defended early portions of the bomber raids and instead mass their fighters in the unescorted zones deep inside Germany. There, beyond the range of the Allied escorts, German fighters could attack the bomber formations with relative impunity, exploiting the brief window when the bombers were vulnerable. This was not a strategy of victory by late 1943. No one in a position of authority in Germany truly believed the Reich could win the war. But it was a strategy of survival, a way to make the Allied bombing campaign so costly that perhaps, somehow, the Allies would agree to a negotiated peace. Every bomber shot down represented not just a tactical victory but a small contribution to that larger, desperate hope. The absence of long-range escorts was the linchpin of this entire approach. Without it, the Luftwaffe's defensive strategy would crumble. German intelligence was well aware of Allied efforts to develop long-range escort fighters. Reports filtered in from frontline units, from agents, from technical analysis of captured aircraft. But the Luftwaffe's technical experts were confident that the fundamental physics of the problem had no easy solution. Yes, the Americans might extend range somewhat better drop tanks, more efficient engines, but to double or triple the combat radius of a fighter, that would require a revolutionary breakthrough, not incremental improvements. And revolutionary breakthroughs, the experts reasoned, took years of development, years the Allies did not have if they wanted to maintain the pressure of their bombing campaign. Moreover, German pilots had already encountered the P-51 Mustang in combat, and their initial assessments were underwhelming. The Mustang had entered service with the Royal Air Force in 1942, and the Luftwaffe had fought against it during low-level reconnaissance and ground attack missions over France and the Low Countries. It was a competent aircraft, certainly well-made, reasonably fast, adequately armed, but it was not a game-changer. In mock dogfights and tactical engagements, the Mustang seemed to perform on par with other Allied fighters, perhaps a bit better in some respects, a bit worse in others. German intelligence reports from that period described it as another fighter of the Spitfire class, a professional acknowledgement of its capabilities, but hardly a cause for alarm. Just another fighter. What German intelligence did not fully appreciate, what they could not have fully appreciated, was that the Mustang they were evaluating in 1942 was fundamentally different from the aircraft that would appear over Berlin in March of 1944. The early Mustangs used an Allison V1710 engine, a reliable American power plant, but one that performed poorly at high altitudes where bomber escort missions were flown. Above 15,000 feet, the Allison-powered Mustang lost power rapidly, making it unsuitable for the high-altitude combat that characterized the air war over Germany. The British and American engineers knew this, and they knew the Mustang's airframe was otherwise exceptional, sleek, aerodynamically efficient, with unusually low drag for a fighter of its era. The problem was not the airframe, it was the engine. The solution came from an unexpected source, a British engine in an American airframe. The Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same engine that powered the Spitfire and the Lancaster bomber, featured a two-stage supercharger that maintained power at high altitudes. In late 1942, the idea of mating the Merlin engine to the Mustang airframe was proposed, and prototypes were rapidly developed. The results were extraordinary. The Merlin-powered Mustang, designated the P-51B, and subsequent variants, was not just an improvement on the original design, it was a transformation. At 25,000 feet, where the air is thin and most fighters struggle, the Merlin Mustang was fast, agile, and deadly. It could outperform the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and match the Focke-Wulf 4 190 in most flight regimes, all while carrying enough fuel to fly escort missions of unprecedented range. The Americans embraced the Merlin Mustang with the urgency of a nation that understood the stakes. By early 1944, production was ramping up rapidly. North American Aviation's factories in California were producing Mustangs at a pace that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier, hundreds per month, then thousands. The aircraft rolled off the assembly lines, were ferried across the Atlantic, and began equipping the fighter groups of the 8th Air Force in England. Each squadron that transitioned to the Mustang represented a quantum leap in the Allies' ability to strike deep into German territory. But range was not just about the engine, it was also about fuel capacity and how that fuel was managed. The Merlin Mustang's internal fuel tanks held more than the early models, but the real breakthrough came from external drop tanks. These disposable auxiliary fuel tanks, slung under the wings or fuselage, could carry an additional 75 to 110 gallons of fuel. The pilot would use the drop tank fuel first, extending the fighter's range as far as possible. When the tanks were empty, or when combat was imminent and the tanks became a liability, the pilot would jettison them, reducing drag and restoring the aircraft's full maneuverability. It was an elegant solution to a previously intractable problem, and it extended the Mustang's effective combat radius to over 1,000 kilometers. Berlin, once safely beyond the reach of Allied fighters, was now within range. The German High Command was slow to grasp the implications. Intelligence reports from early 1944 mentioned the increasing presence of Mustangs among the American escort fighters, but these reports were fragmented and often contradictory. Some Luftwaffe pilots reported that the Mustangs turned back at the usual points, while others claimed they had seen them farther into Germany than should have been possible. The confusion was compounded by the fact that not all Mustang units were immediately equipped with the long-range drop tanks, and operational procedures were still being refined. To the German analysts trying to piece together a coherent picture from scattered combat reports, the Mustang seemed like an incremental improvement, not a revolutionary threat. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe, was particularly dismissive of the reports. Göring had grown increasingly detached from operational realities by 1944, more concerned with his personal art collection and political maneuvering than with the grim arithmetic of air combat. When subordinates raised concerns about the Mustang's range, Göring reportedly waved them off. The laws of aerodynamics, he insisted, were the same for everyone. If the Allies had truly developed a long-range escort fighter, the Luftwaffe's intelligence network would have detected it much earlier. The reports, he suggested, were exaggerations born of the strain of prolonged combat, the psychological tendency of pilots under stress to overestimate the capabilities of their opponents. But the pilots in the cockpits knew something was changing. By February of 1944, combat reports began to converge on a troubling pattern. The Mustangs were not just appearing deeper into Germany, they were staying longer, engaging more aggressively, and showing up in greater numbers. Luftwaffe units that had once relied on the sanctuary of the unescorted zone found themselves under attack by American fighters hundreds of kilometers inside the Reich. The tactical calculations that had governed their operations for 2 years were breaking down. Something fundamental had shifted, but the full scope of that shift would not become clear until the first week of March. The American 8th Air Force, headquartered in England, was acutely aware of what was at stake. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany had been costly, far more costly than pre-war planners had anticipated. The theory had been that heavily armed bomber formations, flying in tight defensive boxes, could protect themselves through sheer firepower. The reality was that even the most heavily armed bomber was vulnerable to determined fighter attack, especially when unescorted. By the end of 1943, losses were approaching unsustainable levels. Some raids suffered casualty rates exceeding 10%, and the psychological toll on the bomber crews was immense. Men flew their required 25 missions, knowing that statistically they were unlikely to survive. The introduction of the long-range Mustang was not just a tactical improvement, it was the key to making the entire strategic bombing campaign viable. The 8th Air Force planned its first escort mission to Berlin with the meticulous care of an operation that would either validate the entire strategy or expose its flaws. The date chosen was March 4, 1944. The bombers would target industrial facilities in the German capital, and for the first time they would have fighter escort all the way to the target and back. The mission was delayed by weather and eventually rescheduled for March 6th. When the day finally arrived, the weather over Europe was clear, good visibility, minimal cloud cover. Ideal conditions for a maximum effort mission. Over 60 P-51 Mustangs from the 354th, 357th, and 363rd Fighter Groups took off from their bases in England in the early morning hours. They climbed to altitude and formed up with the bomber stream. Hundreds of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators arrayed in their characteristic combat boxes. The formation stretched for miles, a river of aircraft droning eastward toward the heart of the Third Reich. For the bomber crews, the presence of the Mustangs was reassuring, but many were skeptical. They had been promised long-range escorts before, only to watch the fighters turn back when fuel ran low. Whether these new Mustangs could truly go the distance remained to be seen. For the Mustang pilots, the mission was a test not just of their aircraft but of their entire operational concept. They flew in a loose weave above and around the bombers, scanning the sky for enemy fighters. The flight across the North Sea and into German airspace was uneventful, but as they crossed into Germany proper, the pilots began to see the Luftwaffe rising to meet them. Dark specks appeared on the horizon, resolving into Messerschmitts and Fokker-Wulfs, climbing to intercept altitude. The radio chatter increased terse warnings, vectors to incoming enemy fighters, acknowledgements. The Mustang pilots jettisoned their drop tanks and prepared for combat. Meanwhile, in the cockpits of the German fighters, confusion and disbelief were mounting. Heinz Nock, climbing toward the bomber stream over central Germany, checked his fuel gauge and calculated how much time he had before he would need to head back to base. He expected the American escorts to be long gone. By now they always were at this distance from England. But as he closed on the bombers, he could see the escorts were still there, circling and weaving, very much present and very much ready to fight. His wingman radioed a terse observation. "They're still here. How are they still here?" Knock had no answer. He had been flying combat missions since 1940, had fought over England during the Battle of Britain, over Russia during the desperate defense of Moscow, and over Germany as the Allies' bombing campaign intensified. He prided himself on his tactical judgment, his ability to read a developing combat situation and exploit enemy weaknesses. But this made no sense. The Americans were nearly at Berlin, and their escorts were still with them. Either the intelligence reports were catastrophically wrong, or something had fundamentally changed. He committed to the attack anyway. Orders were orders, and the bombers had to be stopped. The Messerschmitts dove toward the bomber formation, picking up speed, lining up their gun sights on the lead elements. But before they could close to firing range, the Mustangs were on them. They came slashing down from above, their long noses spitting .50 caliber tracers. Noak broke hard right, pulling his Bf 109 into a steep climbing turn, trying to gain angles on the nearest Mustang. The American pilot anticipated the move and rolled inverted, pulling through into a diving attack that forced Noak into a defensive spiral. The engagement was brief and inconclusive. Neither pilot could gain a decisive advantage, and both broke off, conserving fuel and ammunition. But the psychological message was clear. The Americans were here, over Berlin, and they were not leaving. The bomber formations pressed on to their targets, released their payloads, and turned for home. The Mustangs stayed with them the entire way, fending off repeated Luftwaffe attacks but never abandoning the bombers. For the German pilots, it was a revelation and a nightmare. They had known, intellectually, that the war was not going in Germany's favour. They had seen the industrial disparity, the endless waves of new Allied aircraft replacing those shot down, the way the Luftwaffe's own losses could not be made good. But knowing and experiencing are different things. Watching the Mustangs escort the bombers to Berlin and back again was experiencing the end of any hope that Germany could defend its airspace. If the Allies could strike Berlin with impunity, they could strike anywhere. There was nowhere left to hide. When Heinz Noak landed back at his base that evening, he sat in the cockpit for a long moment, staring at the instrument panel. He was alive, which was more than could be said for some of his squadron mates. But the survival felt hollow. He knew, with the certainty of a man who had spent 4 years learning the hard lessons of war, that what he had witnessed that day was not an anomaly or a lucky break for the Americans. It was the new reality. The Mustangs would be back, and there was nothing the Luftwaffe could do to stop them. The news of the March 6th mission spread quickly through the Luftwaffe's fighter units. Pilots who had not flown that day heard the reports from those who had and struggled to make sense of them. Some refused to believe it. Surely the intelligence officers had made a mistake. Surely the reported sightings of Mustangs over Berlin were misidentifications or exaggerations. But when the missions continued, day after day, with Mustangs appearing consistently over targets deep inside Germany, the denials gave way to grim acceptance. The Americans had done the impossible. They had built a fighter with the range to go anywhere, and they had built it in numbers that made resistance futile. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The P-51 Mustang was not the first long-range fighter, nor was it even the first Allied fighter to be equipped with drop tanks and used for extended escort missions. But it was the first to combine sufficient range with performance that could match or exceed the best German fighters at combat altitude. This combination range and capability was what made it a war-winning weapon. A fighter that could reach Berlin but couldn't defend itself, or the bombers it escorted, would have been useless. Conversely, a highly capable fighter that couldn't reach the target was equally irrelevant. The Mustang achieved both, and in doing so, it changed the strategic balance of the air war in a way that no single aircraft had before or has since. The technical details of why the Mustang worked so well reveal a deeper story about engineering, industrial capacity, and the nature of innovation in wartime. The airframe, designed by North American Aviation's team led by Chief Engineer Edgar Schmude, was a masterpiece of aerodynamic efficiency. Schmude, an Austrian-born immigrant who had fled Europe before the war, brought with him an understanding of European aeronautical principles and a willingness to experiment with unconventional solutions. The Mustang's wing design, in particular, featured a laminar flow airfoil, a shape that minimized drag by encouraging smooth airflow over the wing surface. In theory, laminar flow wings had been understood for years. In practice, they were notoriously difficult to manufacture with the precision required to realize their benefits. North American aviation developed the production techniques to build laminar flow wings at scale, and the result was an aircraft that was measurably faster and more fuel-efficient than its contemporaries. The fuselage was similarly optimized. Unlike many fighters of the era, which featured bulky, angular designs dictated by the need to house large radial engines, the Mustang's inline Merlin engine allowed for a sleek, streamlined nose. The radiator, typically a source of significant drag, was positioned beneath the fuselage in a carefully designed scoop that not only cooled the engine, but actually generated a small amount of forward thrust through a principle known as the Meredith effect. Every detail, from the flush-riveted skin to the retractable tail wheel, was oriented toward reducing drag and maximizing efficiency. The result was an aircraft that could fly farther on a gallon of fuel than any comparable fighter in service. But the Mustang's technical excellence would have been meaningless without the industrial capacity to produce it in the numbers needed. By 1944, the United States was operating at a level of industrial mobilization unprecedented in human history. North American Aviation's plant in Inglewood, California, employed over 40,000 workers and operated around the clock. The assembly lines were marvels of efficiency, with sub-assemblies feeding into the main production line in a carefully choreographed sequence. A Mustang that had been nothing but raw aluminum and steel in the morning could be a complete, ready-to-fly aircraft by the end of the week. By the spring of 1944, North American was producing more than 500 Mustangs per month, and that number would climb even higher as the year progressed. For the Germans, the sheer scale of American production was as demoralizing as the Mustang's technical capabilities. The Luftwaffe shot down Mustangs, many of them in fact. German pilots were skilled and experienced, and in a one-on-one dogfight, a good German pilot in a Bas, late model Bf 109 or FW 190, could often hold his own against a Mustang. But killing Mustangs did not matter when 5 new Mustangs arrived for every one destroyed. The arithmetic of attrition, which had always been unfavorable for Germany, became completely untenable. Every German pilot lost represented years of training and experience that could not be easily replaced. Every American pilot lost was replaced, often within weeks, by a fresh graduate from the massive training pipeline the United States had built. The same was true for aircraft. German fighter production was hampered by material shortages, factory bombings, and the need to divert resources to other critical needs. American production faced no such constraints. The psychological impact of this disparity cannot be overstated. German pilots in the spring and summer of 1944 flew their missions knowing that every sortie might be their last, not because they lacked skill or courage, but because the numbers were against them. They were outnumbered, often by 3 or 4 to 1, and the enemy fighters they faced were equal or superior to their own. The Luftwaffe's veterans, the men who had survived years of combat and accumulated hundreds of missions, began to fall at an accelerating rate. Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's most skilled and decorated pilots, later wrote that by mid-1944 the Luftwaffe had lost air superiority over Germany and could not hope to regain it. The appearance of the long-range Mustang, he said, was the decisive turning point. Once the Americans could escort their bombers all the way to the target and back, the Luftwaffe's defensive strategy collapsed. There were no more safe zones, no more unescorted bombers to attack. Every mission became a battle not just against enemy aircraft, but against the inexorable logic of a war that Germany could not win. For the American bomber crews, the arrival of the Mustang was nothing short of salvation. Men who had flown missions deep into Germany watching their escorts turn back at the German border and knowing they would face the Luftwaffe alone for the next several hours, now had fighters that stayed with them the entire way. The psychological relief was immense. Bomber losses, which had been averaging 8 to 10% per mission in the worst periods of 1943, dropped to 3 to 4% by mid-1944. That difference, seemingly small in percentage terms, translated to hundreds of lives saved and dozens of bombers that returned to fly again. The strategic bombing campaign, which had teetered on the edge of unsustainability, became a grinding but ultimately successful effort to dismantle Germany's war-making capacity. The bomber crews developed an almost superstitious reverence for the Mustang pilots who escorted them. Stories circulated of Mustangs staying with badly damaged bombers, shepherding them back to England even, when doing so meant exposing the fighters to additional risk. There were accounts of Mustang pilots diving into swarms of German fighters to break up attacks, of lone Mustangs taking on entire squadrons to buy time for the bombers to escape. Not all of these stories were literally true. Combat narratives are always embellished in the retelling, but they reflected a deeper truth about the bond that developed between the bomber crews and the fighter pilots who protected them. The Mustang became a symbol of hope, a tangible reminder that the overwhelming material superiority of the United States could be translated into tactical and strategic success. The Germans, for their part, tried desperately to counter the Mustang threat. New tactics were developed, emphasizing hit-and-run attacks that minimized exposure to the escorts. German pilots were instructed to focus on the bombers and disengage if engaged by fighters, to avoid being drawn into dogfights that they were unlikely to win. The Luftwaffe also began deploying its most advanced fighters, the Focke-Wulf Tar 152, the Messerschmitt Bf 109K in greater numbers, hoping that superior performance at extreme altitudes might offset the numerical disadvantage. None of these measures made more than a marginal difference. The Tar 152, for instance, was a fine aircraft, but it was produced in such small numbers that it had no strategic impact. The Bf 109K was faster and better armed than earlier models, but by the time it entered service in significant quantities, the Luftwaffe had already been bled white. Tactics and technology could not overcome the fundamental disparity in resources and industrial capacity. By the summer of 1944, the Mustang-equipped fighter groups of the 8th Air Force were ranging across Germany almost at will. They escorted bombers to targets in Berlin, Munich, Vienna, and beyond. They strafed trains, trucks, and airfields, extending the reach of Allied air power to virtually every corner of the Third Reich. The Luftwaffe, once a fearsome and technologically advanced force, was reduced to a shadow of its former self, its ranks filled with poorly trained pilots flying obsolete aircraft against an enemy that controlled the skies. The transformation was complete. The P-51 Mustang, initially dismissed by German pilots as just another fighter, had become the instrument of the Luftwaffe's destruction. The spring of 1944 marked the beginning of what Luftwaffe pilots would later call the Great Dying. Every day that the weather permitted, the American bomber formations came, and with them came the Mustangs. The missions had a relentless quality, a mechanical inevitability that wore down even the most experienced German pilots. It was not that any individual mission was necessarily more dangerous than those flown in previous years, though losses were certainly high, but rather the cumulative psychological weight of knowing that there would be another mission tomorrow and another the day after that, and that each mission would be contested against an enemy that could not be exhausted or depleted. Oberleutnant Heinz Noack, whose encounter with the Mustangs over Berlin had shaken his confidence in the Luftwaffe's defensive strategy, continued to fly missions through the spring and early summer. His diary entries from this period reflect a growing sense of fatalism. On March 23rd, he wrote of engaging American fighters, almost certainly Mustangs near Hanover, and being forced to break off the attack when his fuel ran dangerously low. The Americans, he noted, seemed to have fuel to spare, circling lazily above the bomber stream while the German fighters struggled to stay airborne long enough to press home their attacks. On April 11th, after another costly engagement, he wrote simply, "We are fighting an enemy who has everything, and we have nothing. How long can this go on?" The answer, though Noak could not have known it at the time, was not much longer. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was losing pilots faster than it could train replacements. The training pipeline, once rigorous and thorough, had been compressed to dangerously inadequate lengths. New pilots arrived at frontline squadrons with as few as 30 hours of flight time in type, barely enough to master basic handling, let alone combat tactics. These young men, many of them teenagers, were thrown into combat against veteran American pilots flying superior aircraft. The results were predictable and tragic. Survival times for new Luftwaffe pilots in the summer of 1944 averaged less than 10 missions. Some died on their first sortie, shot down by Mustang pilots who had scores of missions and dozens of kills to their credit. The disparity in experience was itself a product of the Mustang's impact. In the early years of the war, the Luftwaffe had built up a cadre of exceptionally skilled pilots through combat in Spain, Poland, France, and the Battle of Britain. These men had accumulated hundreds of hours of combat flying time and had developed an intuitive understanding of air combat that could not be taught in any training program. But by 1944, many of these veterans were dead or grounded by injuries. Those who remained were exhausted, flying multiple missions per day against overwhelming odds. The attrition among experienced pilots meant that institutional knowledge was lost. The tactics and techniques that had made the Luftwaffe so effective in the early war years were not passed down because there was no time to pass them down. New pilots learned on the job, and most did not live long enough to become veterans themselves. Major Johannes Steinhoff, a Luftwaffe fighter pilot who would survive the war and later become a senior officer in the post-war German Air Force, described the period from March through August of 1944 as the months when we lost the war in the air. In his post-war memoirs, he recounted missions where his entire squadron would engage a formation of American bombers and escorts, only to be scattered within minutes by aggressive attacks from the Mustang screen. The American pilots, he wrote, flew with a confidence born of numerical superiority and operational security. They knew that if they were shot down over Germany, more Mustangs would arrive tomorrow. The German pilots knew that every loss was irreplaceable. That psychological difference, Steinhoff argued, was as important as any technical or numerical disparity. One specific mission stands out in the historical record for its illustration of how completely the Mustang had changed the strategic balance. On April 24, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched a maximum-effort raid against targets in southern Germany, including the Messerschmitt production facilities at Augsburg and Regensburg. The mission involved over 700 heavy bombers and was escorted by more than 400 fighters, the majority of them P-51 Mustangs. The Luftwaffe scrambled nearly every available fighter to contest the raid, recognizing that the targets were critical to Germany's ability to continue producing aircraft. The resulting air battle was one of the largest of the war, with over 1,000 aircraft engaged in combat across several hundred kilometers of German airspace. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had at the bombers' single-engine fighters, twin-engine fighters, even a few of the experimental rocket-powered Me-163s, which could climb to altitude with astonishing speed but had only minutes of powered flight before their fuel was exhausted. The Germans scored hits on dozens of bombers, and several went down trailing smoke and flame. But for every bomber lost, the Mustang escorts exacted a terrible price. The American fighter pilots, flying in, coordinated teams, tore into the German formations with devastating effectiveness. Mustangs dove through the German fighter screens, engaging multiple opponents simultaneously, using their superior speed and energy retention to dictate the terms of the engagement. By the end of the day, the Luftwaffe had lost over 80 fighters, nearly a third of the force committed to the battle. American losses, while significant, were manageable. 26 bombers, and 11 fighters. The disparity in loss rates told the story of an air force that could no longer defend its own territory against an enemy that controlled the initiative. For the German pilots who survived that mission, the psychological impact was profound. They had done everything right, concentrated their forces, used coordinated attacks, exploited moments when the Mustang screen was temporarily out of position, and yet they had been mauled. The realization settled over the surviving pilots like a shroud. There was nothing they could do, no tactic or strategy, that could overcome the fundamental imbalance of resources. One pilot, whose name does not appear in the historical record but whose account was preserved in post-war interviews, described landing back at his base with his fuel tanks nearly empty, his ammunition expended, and his nerves shattered. He sat in the cockpit, unable to move, until his crew chief climbed up and physically helped him out. "I knew then," he said decades later, "that we had lost. Not the battle, not even the war, those were already decided. We had lost the ability to pretend that we could change the outcome. The Mustang's dominance extended beyond escort missions. As the summer progressed and the Allied invasion of Normandy succeeded in establishing a foothold on the European continent, Mustang squadrons began flying what were called fighter sweeps, offensive missions aimed at destroying the Luftwaffe on the ground and in the air. These missions ranged deep into Germany, strafing airfields, railways, and supply convoys. The Mustang's range, which had initially been developed to escort bombers, now allowed it to carry the war to the enemy's rear areas in a way that no previous Allied fighter could. Luftwaffe pilots found that even when they were not airborne, they were not safe. Mustangs appeared over their bases without warning, catching aircraft on the ground during refueling or rearming. Pilots scrambling to take off were shot down before they could gain altitude. The operational tempo became unsustainable. Adolf Galland, by this time a general and the commander of the Luftwaffe's fighter forces, pleaded with Hermann Göring and the High Command for resources to rebuild the fighter arm. He advocated for a focus on producing and deploying the Messerschmitt Me 262, a jet-powered fighter that was faster than any Allied propeller-driven aircraft and could, in theory, engage bombers and fighters on more favorable terms. But the Me 262 program was beset by delays, resource shortages, and Hitler's insistence that the aircraft be developed as a bomber rather than a fighter. By the time significant numbers of Me 262s entered service in early 1945, it was far too late to affect the outcome of the air war. The Mustang and the industrial power behind it had already won. The strategic consequences of the Mustang's impact rippled far beyond the air war itself. The Allied bombing campaign, now prosecuted with relative impunity thanks to the Mustang's escort capability, systematically destroyed Germany's ability to wage war. Oil refineries, synthetic fuel plants, and transportation networks were targeted with increasing precision and effectiveness. By the autumn of 1944, fuel shortages had become so severe that the Luftwaffe grounded entire fighter wings simply because there was no fuel to fly them. The German war machine, which had relied on mechanized mobility and tactical air support, ground to a halt. Even the fearsome panzer divisions found themselves unable to maneuver effectively without fuel, and with Allied fighter bombers, many of them Mustangs, roaming the skies over the battlefield. The psychological transformation of German pilots from confidence to despair is one of the war's most telling narratives. Men who had entered the Luftwaffe believing they were part of an elite force, flying for a cause they had been taught to see as just, found themselves trapped in a hopeless struggle against an enemy whose material superiority was overwhelming. Some became cynical, flying their missions mechanically, doing what was expected but no longer believing in victory or even survival. Others clung to increasingly desperate fantasies, wonder weapons that would turn the tide, secret negotiations that would end the war on favorable terms, anything to avoid confronting the reality of impending defeat. A few, like Heinz Nock, recorded their thoughts with unflinching honesty, documenting the slow collapse of the Luftwaffe and, by extension, the Third Reich. Noakes' final diary entry from the war, dated April 30th, 1945, is a study in exhaustion and disillusionment. By that point, the war in Europe was in its final days. Soviet forces were fighting in the streets of Berlin. American and British forces had overrun Western Germany. The Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Noakes wrote of flying his last combat mission, engaging Allied fighters over northern Germany, and landing with almost no fuel and only a handful of rounds remaining in his guns. "It is over," he wrote. "We fought as hard as we could, and it was not enough. It was never going to be enough. The Americans had too much of everything: aircraft, fuel, ammunition, pilots, and we had nothing but determination, and determination alone does not win wars." The legacy of the P-51 Mustang extends far beyond its combat record in World War II, though that record alone is remarkable. Mustangs were credited with nearly 5,000 air-to-air kills during the war, more than any other Allied fighter in the European theatre. But numbers alone do not capture the aircraft's significance. The Mustang was the weapon that made strategic bombing viable, that broke the back of the Luftwaffe, and that demonstrated the decisive importance of air superiority in modern warfare. It proved that with the right combination of technology, industrial capacity, and strategic vision, a single weapons system could alter the course of a war. For the German pilots who faced the Mustang in combat, the aircraft became a symbol of everything they were fighting against and everything they could not defeat. It represented American industrial might, the ability to design and produce a war-winning weapon in quantities that overwhelmed any tactical or strategic response. It represented the collapse of the Luftwaffe's defensive strategy and of the end of any hope that Germany could defend its airspace. And on a more personal level, it represented the daily, grinding reality of flying against an enemy that could not be exhausted, could not be intimidated, and could not be stopped. The initial dismissal, "just another fighter," was understandable. The early Allison-powered Mustangs were competent but unremarkable, but the transformation to the Merlin-powered version, combined with drop tanks and a strategic doctrine that leveraged its range, turned the Mustang into something far more dangerous than its appearance suggested. The German failure to anticipate this transformation was not a failure of intelligence or analysis, but a failure to grasp the scale of American industrial mobilization and the speed with which that industry could translate theoretical designs into operational weapons. By the time the Luftwaffe fully understood what the Mustang represented, it was too late to respond effectively. The air war over Europe in World War II is often remembered for its dramatic dogfights, its aces with their dozens of kills, its stories of individual heroism and sacrifice. These stories are true and important, but they obscure a deeper truth. Wars are won not by individual heroes, but by industrial systems, by the ability to produce more of everything than the enemy can destroy, and by strategic decisions that leverage technological and material advantages. The P-51 Mustang was the embodiment of that truth. It was not the most glamorous aircraft of the war, nor the most technically advanced in every respect, but it was the right aircraft, at the right time, produced in the right numbers, and deployed with the right strategy. That combination made it the weapon that won the air war over Europe. For the men who flew it, the Mustang was a tool, reliable, capable, and well-suited to the mission. For the men who faced it, the Mustang was an omen, a herald of inevitable defeat. And for historians looking back, the Mustang stands as a case study in how wars are really won, not through martial valor alone, though valor matters, but through the unglamorous work of engineering, production, logistics, and strategic planning. The Mustang over Berlin in March of 1944 was not just a fighter plane escorting bombers. It was the physical manifestation of American power, the proof that the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt, and the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. When Oberleutnant Heinz Nock looked up that morning and saw the Mustangs still there, hundreds of kilometers inside Germany, he understood something that his superiors would take months more to accept. The war was over, and Germany had lost. The only question was how long the dying would continue. The Mustang provided the answer, until there was nothing left to fight with and no one left to fly. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.